ultimately it could be the sign of the Son of Man, the sign of Jesus, our King, returning, and we're pretty excited about that.
Yes.
Gosh, where to start?
There's so many places to start. I mean, in my book, I discovered that it might be that both the creation, nativity, and the end times are all linked up together. In fact, the entire outer parameters and framework of the Bible appear to be basically all about Planet X interacting with the early solar system and creating the Earth in its present form, returning several times, most notably in the middle of the Bible as the star of the Nativity, the Star of Bethlehem, and also probably returning at the end of the age to herald the second coming of Christ as the sign of the Son of Man and the end of the age, as described in Matthew 24:30.
Wow, praise Jesus. So how how is it that, if we rewind way back, the whole thing with, the creation of the heavens and the earth, and, how much synchronicity did you find when you did your research with, some of the, hypothetical or postulations regarding the Van Allen belt, potentially angel wars, fallen angel wars that may have happened, millions of years ago? I mean, how is it involved in, what is your hypothesis on Planet X and how it may have been involved in the creation of the Earth?
The creation there specifically not having to do with the angels per se, but the theory is based partly on writings of people like Zechariah Sitchin, but also modified and primarily controlled by the writings of mainstream astronomers. Come to the conclusion that probably a large planet-sized object invaded our solar system in ancient times and interacted with all of the outer planets and many of the inner planets, all the way through to the fourth planet in our solar system, the Earth. And the interaction with the fourth planet was so tremendous that it actually hurled it into a new orbit closer to the sun. And this, when you look at Genesis and one and the other biblical references to the creation in that mindset, which is not just from pseudoscientist types like Zechariah Sitchin, but this is mainstream science, because Planet X was a mainstream scientific theory that's over 120, 130 years old now. You realize that despite the fact that Sitchin may have taken a lot of liberties, in fact the most liberties with the concept, the core concept of Planet X, of a Planet X invading our solar system and interacting with the Earth, is sound from a scientific perspective. And also I have found from a biblical and exegetical perspective, it works.
Yeah. So speaking of which, are you, when I look at some of the things in your book that you identified as potentially being associated with, the, elliptical, motion of the Planet X solar system, for lack of a better term.
There's actually Planet X came around 2000 BC also, and was responsible not only for the destruction of the empire of Sumer, but also for the destruction of Job, who lived in the suburbs of Sumer. And the book of Job is actually not simply a sort of a poetical back and forth between God about theological concepts. It's actually the Hebrew equivalent of the Babylonian creation epic, written about the same time as the Babylonians wrote their version, except the book of Job was written from the point of view of a monotheist, which means you cannot use, as did the Babylonians, a battle between various gods and goddesses in heaven, because that would be polytheistic and therefore unacceptable from a monotheistic perspective. Therefore, Job was written as more of a intellectual conversation between God and man, into which were encoded all of the secrets, oral traditions, and so forth that had been in circulation at that time, into one long narrative, just as the Babylonians did the same with their methodology using Enumerated, which is more of a dramatic play. So basically, I believe we have in the Bible at least three, not counting the creation itself, at least three references to the appearance of Planet X. One at 2000 BC when Job was written, actually about somewhere around 1930 BC, to be more specific. Two around 0 BC when Jesus was born, and probably sometime again in our time when it'll reappear as the sign of the Son of Man at the end of the age.
Okay, so you're suggesting that potentially the periodicity is about 2,000 years.
Correct.
Wow, that's interesting because that kind of aligns with the retrograde precession of the equinox, give or take a few years here or there, right?
No, I didn't even think of that. That's very prescient. 21 and 60 years, something along those lines.
Yeah, exactly. Praise Jesus, because right now, I mean, if depending on, who you study and and such, we're arguably moving, or have just recently moved into the age of Aquarius, arguably the age of the water bearer, which many believe is the age of Lucifer. Yeah, and then you've got that coinciding with the Hebrew year of 5773, where that aligns with where the Zohar calls out the rival of their Messiah, which would ultimately be the Antichrist, and that year, which we just entered in September of last year. So we're in the midst of that of the muck, if you will, of the mud associated with that 2,000-year cycle. So I'm really I'm fascinated. This is exciting, folks. Praise Jesus. Wow. No, this is because I'm a big believer that we are like right there, and something big's about to break any moment.
I agree.
Praise God.
Along the lines of your idea of the age of Aquarius. It says in Revelation 22:1 that there is a pure river of water of life proceeding out of the throne of God and the Lamb. I think that age, or the idea of the water bearer, not necessarily Lucifer, but actually indicating that will be the age when Jesus, or the Messiah, the Son of God, will return and pour out healing waters upon the earth and heal it from all the wounds and poisons of the fallen angels have been pouring out for so many thousands of years.
Well, yeah, but you know what? I totally agree with what you just said, because you've got, and I don't, but, okay, we know that Lucifer is the great, a forger or hijacker of all things of God. So you've got the book by Dr. Kennedy, The Real Meaning of the Zodiac. You've got the writings of, Bullinger, you know what I'm saying? So it makes complete sense that something that God's artwork would be depicting ultimately as a good thing would be hijacked by the occult as, well, this is a great time because this is when Lucifer is going to be cast down to heaven and the Great Tribulation is ultimately going to start.
And that's a very good point, because I believe since the beginning, even the creation of the universe, Satan and his minions were unable to create anything of worth or create anything original. They're only able to modify and twist those things that God created originally. They are incapable of creating anything good or of lasting value. They can only corrupt that which God creates and turn it into a lie, a shadow of the original truth. The constellations being a classic example.
Oh yeah, amen. So, what role do you see the Planet X ultimately playing? When you look at I know what I think, and everybody forms their own little postulations, and I think it's just neat to just kind of overlay them like transparencies on an overhead and kind of see where they all line up. But how do you perceive, the role of Planet X, and do you see it as ultimately being the root cause of Isaiah 24, potentially the root cause of a lot of the elements of the trumpet judgments and the wrath, or the final bowl judgments? How do you see this all unfolding? If you were to just kind of like paint us a picture, how do you think it's going to play out?
I think that just as it was at the beginning, so will it be in the end. Some theologians, such as Sigmund Mowinkle, he was a kind of a theologian of the late 19th century. He posited that and I agree with him, that the imagery revolving around the creation appears to be repeated in the end times. This specifically between the battle between God and the dragon, as described in Isaiah 27 and Psalm 74. Isaiah 27 actually says, in that time God will defeat the dragon Leviathan, the dragon that lives in the sea. This is a Leviathan typically before that time, described in Job 40, for example, was seen as the enemy of God at the creation. And parallel ancient and Eastern texts, along with Psalm 74, indicate that the ancients believed, including the Hebrews, that the earth was created from the head of a dragon, symbolic of a planet which was wicked in character and had to be destroyed. And it's a part of it actually was retained for use on a later planet, which was made from the remains of the previous planet. And similar activities will occur in the end times when Planet X will return, and there'll be another battle between these two planets, which Planet X, Nibiru, call it what you will, will interact with Earth once again in a up close and personal way as it did in the beginning, and they'll cause great cataclysm and destruction of all the nations, and all the cities will fall. All the trumpets and all the bowls will all be related to Planet X, most if not all of them. If you look at the trumpets, and I go through this pretty thoroughly in the book, it sounds like most of them are either asteroids or comets, either directly impacting Earth or passing close enough to Earth for their, for example, the cometary tail to dump a great deal of material into Earth's atmosphere. For example, I think I figured out what wormwood is. Wormwood is, in my opinion, a comet, which was comprised of much of the material that was thrown up into space after the original Earth was struck by one of Planet X satellites. I believe there was probably at least primitive life forms on that Earth, maybe which Lucifer and the fallen angels have been experimenting with, and possibly in an attempt to preempt God's ultimate plan to create life on this Earth. And that life was illegal and had to be destroyed. So God sent Planet X in as part of his plan to annihilate that life, the plants and animals that the fallen angels had created, or attempted to create. And those were pulverized and thrown into space. And as a result, the plant life that existed on this previous Earth had psychedelic compounds in it, which were like wormwood. Wormwood being basically Artemisia absinthium, which is a plant which is used to create absinthe, which is a kind of a narcotic alcoholic beverage which has hallucinogenic properties. So what I believe what they're trying to communicate in this description of wormwood, the comet wormwood, is that this comet will contain much of the original pulverized plant life of the original Earth that was in orbit all this time. It will pass near enough to Earth to pass through its atmosphere, and that super concentrated powdered plant life, which has hallucinogenic properties, will be reintroduced into Earth's hydrosphere, going to the lakes and the rivers, and then the clouds, of course. And then whoever drinks that will have a very powerful hallucinogenic trip, which will basically probably drive them insane and make the worsening situation even more bad, because not only is the world falling apart around them, they are no longer fully sane. So this is part of God's punishment, is to not only destroy the world, but also drive them insane. And this is all part of the sort of a preliminary attack to weaken up Earth and the forces of Earth prior to the Battle of Armageddon, which is literally a battle between the forces of heaven and the forces of Earth. Many of the people you see around here might be in uniform, fighting against God himself in the end times. So it's going to be kind of an interesting, if you think about it, you have to think about it in those terms. This literally will be mankind fighting against God himself, using the weapons of the fallen angels that have given them, weapons that are technological in nature. And so these judgments, these asteroids impacting these comets and so forth, passing through Earth's atmosphere, causing various forms of destruction and degradation of the empire of the beast, will be sort of more like using artillery. A modern army might use artillery to soften up an enemy prior to a final invasion.
Oh, right. Praise God. Kenneth?
Hey, Doug. This is Ken. So glad you could be on tonight. So your 2,000-year timeline sounds very interesting, and I guess you've I didn't read your book, but I'm supposing that's kind of a good answer for Joshua 10:13, where the sun stood still also. And then if you go back further, I guess that's the Noahic flood. And have you put it into a timeline? I guess that's my question. Have you actually just laid it down to some of these biblical events that are catastrophic in nature, like the sun stand still moment, the flood, and do they line up?
I think they line up with all the major events except for the Exodus and the book of Joshua events. Joshua probably was one or more meteorites striking the Earth at an oblique angle and causing the Earth's crust to temporarily lose grip with the mantle and flow backwards, or at least goes more slowly than it does normally. That's why the sun could rise up again, because it was, relatively speaking, the Earth's crust was moving backwards temporarily, probably because of one or more impactors. But the Exodus event and the Joshua events don't fit in with the 2,000-year timeline, so I tend not to talk about them, even though it would kind of make sense. It doesn't seem to work. The Joshua and Exodus events were bracketed by Job about 600 or 700 years earlier, and Jesus, the birth of Christ, about 1,400 years later. So it doesn't, but it does fit the Book of Job, and it does fit probably the Great Flood, which probably occurred around 10,000 BC. And it fits, of course, the Star of Bethlehem and, of course, our times as well.
So I was reading your bio. You went to a very good, one of the top-notch Christian schools, Wheaton College, and then you end up writing this book. What sparked it in you that you dove into this type of topic? Because it's not the typical type of thing that I could even bring up in my church that look at me like I had a third eye growing out of my forehead. So what sparked it in you that got you into this study?
Well, when I was in undergrad, I had a feeling that Jesus was going to return in our lifetime, and I felt strong compulsion to figure out when he was coming and what the motive would be and so forth. And one of the things I read when I was reading about the second coming was Matthew 24, which speaks prominently about a sign which precedes Christ's second coming. Now, I was taught, and I still believe, that the words of Christ supersede everything. The red words are always, the most important ones. And so I took the Matthew 24, which is Jesus' description of what the end times will be like, as sort of the guide text for the rest of the apocalyptic literature I was reading. And it occurred to me that the most prominent mention of his immediate return was what he described in Matthew 24:30 as the sign of the Son of Man at the end of the age, or as the sign of the Son of Man, which will appear in heaven immediately prior to his return. And so I set out to figure out what could this sign be? Is it some sort of spiritual thing? Is it a heavenly object like a comet or a conjunction like they say with the Star of Bethlehem is supposed to be? And so I determined maybe, first of all, one of my assumptions was if Jesus is accompanied or preceded by the Star of Bethlehem prior to his first coming, maybe he's preceded by the same object or a similar object in his second coming. Why have the same guy preceded by two different objects? His heavenly sign would probably be the same thing, I would think. So I proceeded on that assumption. And based on that, I started analyzing the Star of Bethlehem information, people doing research on what that might have been. And it fell into three general categories: a comet, a supernova, or a conjunction of planets. But none of those really worked because conjunction of planets, there were a number of conjunctions around that time, but none of them lasted for more than a day or two. And the Magi had to travel a couple of months from Persia to get there, so it would have been at least 2 or 3 months probably. So that didn't work. The supernova, there was one that was maybe between 5 and 10 BC, but it didn't last very long either. Those don't last for more than a few days either. And of course the comet, even though those sometimes last a couple of weeks, they're actually typically in the ancient world thought of to be harbingers of disaster, not of a good thing, like I discussed previously with the comet passing through Earth's atmosphere. It might be in the ancient past. When comets pass through our atmosphere, similar disasters happen, poison fell from the sky, and it did harm to people. That might be where the idea of a comet being a herald of disaster originally came from. And so really those three basic ideas that were discussed by all the scholars I wrote, Christian scholars, I read on the subject, doing just independent research. And so I was about to give up on that angle, thinking, nobody really knows, until I came across this strange book written by some guy named Zechariah Sitchin, it was called The 12th Planet. I was like, what's the 12th planet? I thought I only had 9 planets, so I checked that out. I had nothing else to lose, so I looked at it and I realized, I first came across the idea of Planet X, which had actually been around for, by that time, close to 100 years. This was he wrote his book in 1975, and I read it in 1987, I think it was. And I realized this was the answer. There, another planet in our solar system, which comes and goes on a regular basis over thousands of years, would be a perfect answer to the question of what was the Star of Bethlehem and or the sign of the Son of Man at the end of the age. It fulfilled all the criteria. It made sense. It was a mainstream scientific idea, and no one else thought of it. So I decided to pursue that as kind of my passion, to figure out, is this what the sign of the Son of Man is? And since then, the research I did at that time and since has become so overwhelming in favor of that theory that I decided to go ahead and formalize my education, pick up a degree in Old Testament Biblical Studies from Wheaton College. I'd actually gotten a marketing communications degree there too. I took some additional classes in theology and took 2 years of Hebrew exegesis there as part of the additional master's degree I picked up there in Old Testament Biblical Studies. And I did some real research in the Bible and realized, this actually does work. It's not exactly mainstream like you mentioned, but neither was the idea of a conjunction of planets, which is really astrology gave it a Christian veneer, and is much less appropriate than this. And once people get the idea, it's just a matter of time till they either accept it or reject it. And at this point, I've received such almost universal acceptance of the idea, at least if not agreement, open-mindedness about the possibility that it could be an answer. And so I've continued to pursue this and promote the idea because I believe it's accurate.
So how did you have an opportunity to share it with any of the professors or any of the academics in Christianity? How was it received, if you did? And
yeah, I actually did an independent study on the Star of Bethlehem to fill some credits, and I forwarded the idea that it was actually a 10th planet in our solar system, and the teacher thought that was an interesting idea, but he didn't feel particularly positive or negative about it. But he, it's a perfectly legitimate theory because it's based on real science, and whether or not it's actually true is something else, but the theory itself is sound.
Yeah, we cover on this show the fact that you've said it's good solid science. There's an Italian astrophysicist. His mind slips me right now, but he's done a lot of studies with the eccentricity of the moon, and he's shown that there has to be another gravitational force within the solar system, a significant gravitational force causing that perturbation. Then you've got the paleontologists, and I don't agree with their cycle, but they claim that the Earth has faced these extinction-level events on numerous occasions because of some sort of impactor in this solar system. And you've got some of the other astrophysicists, even at NASA, suggesting it's highly probable that this sun system is actually binary in nature, and the other sun just never ignited, so it's a brown dwarf. And they've gone as far to say is they'll find it, they just haven't found it yet. So it's very good science, and there's a lot more, and it's just something that's not received very well. And I think it's going to have a lot of people just in shock and awe. So how do you think or see it's going to actually become manifest or apparent to people? What's your theory on that?
My theory is that Planet X will not actually become visible until the middle of the tribulation. That's based on Revelation, I think it's Revelation 5, where it says that men will try to bury themselves under the rocks in the mountains, seeking to hide themselves from the face of the throne of the Lamb, because I think what they're saying is that is actually, they're able to visibly see Planet X appearing in the heaven and realizing that this is God returning, or it's the sign of God returning to avenge his people, which just prior to that time had all been slaughtered according to the fifth seal. And so I think what's happening here is in the middle of tribulation we have the Antichrist will not only reveal himself, but so will Christ, the sign of his coming, of his return, will appear in heaven, possibly to trump the ascent of the Antichrist to the false throne he creates for himself. And that is a sign of the imminent judgment. And when Planet X actually returns at the height of the trumpet judgments, the seventh trumpet most likely, that is when the bowls are poured. And the bowls are poured as Planet X passes near Earth, when the fullness of the wrath of God is poured out upon the Earth. No more Mr. Nice Guy. When Planet X comes by, it's going to wipe out everything that is left that the trumpets didn't leave standing. Basically, the city will be destroyed. All the rivers and the lakes and the oceans will turn to blood. Everything in them will be dead. All the trees and the green grass will be destroyed. And anyone who isn't wearing Sentan lotion level 1 million is going to have a really bad day.
Praise God. Yeah, isn't that the truth? Yeah, just the first trumpet alone, what, a third of the grass and all the trees or something burns. It sure sounds to me like the end of the movie Knowing with Nicolas Cage. Did you notice that in that movie?
I didn't see the movie because I heard it was kind of blasphemous, but I might watch it sometime.
Yeah, the very end scene basically was, well, the Earth burning, looked like it was ultimately a major solar flare of some type that caused the Earth's surface to just burn. It was very sobering. Praise God, very sobering.
I believe what will happen in the end is, as it passes near, Planet X is a gigantic comet's tail, which will fill the sky, and this will have the effect of reflecting sunlight back onto the Earth, even when it's nighttime. That's why it says, I forget exactly where, there'll be a day when its night will be like light. There'll be no night. There'll be no nighttime. It'll be either you're getting light from the sun or reflected off of Planet X's tail, and as a result, the temperatures are going to go up into the hundreds of degrees, and anyone, like I said, who is on the surface will probably be killed by the heat. And it says in the bowl judgments, men will blaspheme God because of the heat and because of the rocks that are falling from the sky. This is what's happening. Planet X is basically bombarding Earth with asteroids, and it's the reflection of the Earth, of the sun's light off of its tail, is baking everyone on the Earth and killing all the remaining life that didn't manage to get underground in time.
So, when you look at, the Revelation 6 verse 12, for example, where you're seeing the opening of the sixth seal, and it says, for example, it says, I looked and he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there's a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood. The stars fell, the stars of heaven fell to the earth like fig trees drop its late figs when shaken by a mighty wind. And then it gets really interesting. It says the sky receded as a scroll when it's rolled up, and this is fascinating here, every mountain and island was moved out of its place. Boy, that sounds suspiciously like a Velikovsky pole shift.
Yeah, in order to be moved out of their places, they would have to have the Earth's crust moving, independent of the mantle, like we described with the long day of Joshua. If you have one or more large asteroids hitting the Earth's crust at an oblique angle, so that it's away from the direct direction of its rotation, that will slow it down or even stop it or possibly even reverse it, depending on how much energy is imparted. And this would have the effect of turning back the clock, as it will, and making the day longer and effectively moving everything on Earth so that things are no longer in line with Earth's magnetic field, and all the clocks and magnetometers and everything else are all screwed up.
Yeah, amen. So tell us a little bit about, I'm fascinated about, Job, the Hebrew creation epic from your book. Can you talk to us a little bit about, the man in the moon, Job's companions, the comets, and that whole thing? Because the book of Job is absolutely, it's very fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Well, my theory is that Job is actually the Hebrew equivalent of the Babylonian creation epic. Now, the Babylonians and the Hebrews actually both originated from Sumer, Ur of the Chaldees specifically. And it says that Abraham came forth from Ur of the Chaldees. That was Ur of the capital of Sumer. Some academics believe that the Hebrews actually derived their mythology or their theology from Sumer, but I believe it was actually a parallel tradition. Both came from the same core concepts, which are all the way back to the beginning. But sometime around the time of the destruction of Sumer, they divided into two branches. One was the Hebrew version, which went with Abraham over to Canaan, and the one that remained in Mesopotamia, which became known as the Babylonian Recension. That is the one done by some of the Babylonians who took over the region after the Sumerians were destroyed. The Sumerian Empire was destroyed by fire from heaven. And as a result, I noted distinct similarities between the two traditions. For example, you have Job, this man who was the chiefest of the men of the East, and he was a cattle bearer. In other words, he was closely associated with the raising of bulls. And he had 11 He had one wife and 10 sons and daughters for a total of 11. Notice that was the same number as the, along with Job, the helpers of Tiamat in the Babylonian version, the dragon who was actually symbolic of the earth. She brought forth 12 helpers to help her in her fight against the high god of the Babylonians, which was called Marduk. The Babylonians kind of took God out of the equation and replaced him with their god Marduk, but I believe that the Hebrew God, as it is in the Bible, is the original God that was given the glory in that particular story, but they had fallen into idolatry and started replacing the one true God with their own false gods. But basically, the Hebrew version, since they couldn't use things like fiery dragons and serpents and the names of deities like they have in the Babylonian version, they instead used Job being the chief of these 12, were kind of in rebellion against God, and the 11 wife and sons and daughters, which made up a total of 11. And just as in a Babylonian creation epic, God sent a great wind in both the Babylonian creation epic and in Job. The chief deity of both stories used a great wind to destroy the group of 12 in both stories. And in the book of Job, Job is actually, let's talk about Enuma Elish first. Enuma Elish, the chief of these 12, was killed, and his body was used to form the moon. And the moon remained in heaven. It was covered with dust and ashes and so forth. And it was used. It was described as having horns, which showed the seasons. It was kind of described as kind of a heavenly bull, and the horns were like, the crescent moon and so forth, which looked kind of like horns. But in the Hebrews, what the Hebrews did was they said, we'll have a real man here, probably Jobab of the line of Seth, as described in Genesis 10. We're going to place this story. We're going to put it at the center of the story, and make it kind of a derived story based on real events, which it was a story that was based on real events, but it was constructed to a certain extent, in order to incorporate this information. So Job was given 11 sons and daughters. These beings were killed, just as were the helpers of Tiamat, the 11 which were thrown into orbits around the sun to become the comets. These 11 were destroyed also, and Job was left sitting in a pile of ashes covered with sores. Now, what they intended to communicate by this, describing this being like this, is that the moon, when it was created, was covered in a pile of ashes or dust like it is today. It was probably covered with impact craters, which, from the perspective of the Earth, looked like oozing sores. And now I believe Job was described in the same way. He was covered with dust, just like the moon, and also covered with oozing sores. Same kind of concept, different modality. Instead of using kind of the name of a deity, I think his name was Dogai or something like that, they used Job. Dogai was like the god of death of the Mesopotamians, so they couldn't use that. So instead, they used a real man and said, okay, he's playing the role of the moon, and we're going to cover him with sores and dust, and he will be the leader of the 11, which God will chasten and use to create mankind. And in the Babylonian creation epic, the blood of the deity named Kingu who was turned into the moon. His blood was used to create mankind, which was interesting by itself. But you have a parallel of the 11 in both Enuma Elish and in Job. You have the leader of the 12 defeated and imprisoned, covered with sores and with dust. And both are associated with heavenly bulls, because the moon was said to have horns like a bull when it had a crescent shape. And Job was also a cattle herder, so he was also associated with bulls. And the person who represents Tiamat, the dragon, in Enuma Elish, is represented by the empire of Sumer in the book of Job, which is described not as Ur, which means the city of light, but as Uz, which means the city of enchantments or the city of magic. So the city of Ur is represented kind of like in a cipher, like, for example, Babel is described as Balal, city of confusion, by Moses. So too, Ur is described as Uz, city of enchantments. So my theory is that in Job, the land of Ur, and by extension Sumer, was considered to be the evil, wicked dragon which was destroyed by God. And Job, the chief of the men of the East, i.e. the chief of the men of Sumer, the most richest man in Sumer, he was humbled and brought down. All of his children were killed off, and his wife. and he was forced to become God's servant once again and humbled. I think this is the way that Job was written, in a way that was theologically correct, yet still remained faithful to the original concept of the dragon and her 12 helpers fighting against God.
So Doug, you mentioned the Enuma Elish, and I think they call the star in there the Star of Marduk. Is that correct?
Yes, they named it after the Babylonian deity Marduk.
So what's your read on there? I mean, how good is that story? What's your opinion on it?
It appears the intention of this story was to recall this information about how the earth was originally created. Over time, it became theologically created with the names of various deities, to the point where it became difficult to figure out what was going on. But the core concepts remained the same. For example, even though the name of the chief deity in heaven, who was a star, specifically a planet, which was described to have interacted with and destroyed the former Earth, it was actually described as a star in the text. It was originally referred to as Anu, which simply is the word for heaven in the Sumerian cosmology. And the word Anu actually is represented by an 8-grade star, the Dingir, which looks very much like the Star of Bethlehem star we still use today. And after Anu became Enlil, after the Sumerians were defeated by the Akkadians replaced Anu with their high chief deity Enlil. And after the Sumerian Akkadian Empire was defeated by the Babylonians, or actually taken over by the Babylonians after they were destroyed by fire from heaven, they took the old story and then replaced their god Marduk in as chief of the creator of the heavens and earth. Though the name of the deity changed, the original concepts remained the same. Basically, you have a star or planet entering into our solar system and interacting with Earth, splitting into two pieces, and setting the head, or the larger piece of the head, in a new orbit around the sun, where it became known today as the Earth. That's the basic story.
So where are you at with this whole concept of aliens? You know, you've got a lot of people in the I don't want to call it the fringe Christian realm, but the more maybe advanced thinking realm. You've got Chuck Missler saying they're interdimensional. You've got other people saying they're both. What's your read on this whole concept of the alien?
The aliens are the same fallen angels that have been interacting with mankind since the beginning. The only reason they appear to be technological in nature now is because we understand not only what technology is, but as opposed to being distinguished from magic. And if magic exists, which I'm not sure it does, it's just a matter of us not only understanding what technology is, but actually having it. Otherwise, there's really no difference in the way they operate and the way, how they abduct people and take children out of women's wombs prior to full gestation period, and so forth. That's all identical to that described in ancient texts, such as the Book of Enoch, which described that very same thing, with the fallen angels procreate with women and raise what they literally refer to as bastard sons, that is, sons who are illegitimately begotten, and they also refer to them as abortions, which is a good description because the alien hybrids are in the Book of Enoch are removed from the womb of the women prior to full gestation, just as they are with the alien processes we're seeing now. So I'm just not seeing any difference at all. So I proceed on the assumption that they are the same thing.
Okay, so when you hear scripture, that says, and they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots, of many horses running into battle. And they had tails like scorpions, and they were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men for 5 months. And you see, for their power is in their mouths and their tails are like serpents having heads, then they do harm with it. You see this as some sort of a permutation or twist on some type of fallen angelic entity of a sort, or how do you, surely we're not, back in the 70s where Jack Van Impe's saying these things are helicopters, right?
No, I think what these actually are And we're beginning to see these made now. These are actually small technological vehicles that look like insects. We're seeing these being made now by the military. And these will be used, I believe, to inject one or more diseases into the people who are remaining on Earth who have taken the mark of the beast. These things will be let loose with a payload of possibly a Morgellons-type virus, which will cause fibers to grow inside of their bodies and basically wire them up in preparation for total control from a central computer. So these individual things look like locusts because they actually are kind of insect-like in character. They're not like helicopters. They're actually remotely, I forget the exact term, but they're small remote vehicles which are designed to inject people with a virus, one or more viruses, for the purpose of controlling them.
Okay, well, speaking of Morgellons and all that, that's an interesting segue. I'm curious, so how do you see this whole chemtrail, aerosol crimes, Morgellons, fit extensions, race within a race, hybridization of mankind? How do you see that all, adding up to the, the big picture as things get real ugly and dark in the midst of the Great Tribulation? How do you see this all kind of fitting together?
My theory is, and I talk about this in my book, The Riddle of the Sphinx, which is available on Amazon Kindle. Basically, what they will find, described, I think it's Daniel 11. The Antichrist will conquer the entire Middle East, from all the way from Afghanistan all the way down to the Sudan, and they will take the treasures of Egypt. And the greatest of the treasures of Egypt is something that is buried underneath the Sphinx. And what is buried underneath the Sphinx, is my theories, is a great sapphire stone, which is basically, for lack of a better term, a massively powerful supercomputer that was hidden there from the world before the flood. It was so dangerous that it had to be hidden and kept out of the hands of man, because it was one of the primary reasons the flood was sent, because man had become so intelligent that he was able to enslave mankind to the point where they could literally not buy and sell without centralized control, like it is in the book of Revelation. Really, Revelation is just a redo, in my opinion, of what happened in the world before the flood. So what they will find underneath the Sphinx is a supercomputer. It had been held there based on the prophecy of Judah in, I think it's Genesis 49, that something will be found underneath the Sphinx. And the Antichrist will take this object and use it to control all the computers of the earth. And this, along with an embedded chip in each person, which is the mark, and also the Morgellons-type disease, which I mentioned previously, which will create a wired network inside of the body. The Antichrist will literally be able to physically control everyone on Earth who takes the mark. So in other words, this mark, these fibers will be able to override the natural nerve impulses from the brain and cause a person to walk and to talk and say different things than they wanted to otherwise. And it could actually literally remote control people. And the army of the beast will probably be a remote control army, which would be necessary in order for them to fight against the second coming, because surely seeing this massive armies of heaven in all their glory would rout any normal army. So in order to make sure that army doesn't rout, Satan has to have literal physical control of every single soldier, so that at a push of a button he can cause them all to do whatever he wants. That is the end game that I'm thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Kenneth?
Doug, your comment about the little flying vehicles, whatever they may be called, Sunday Morning today, CBS Sunday Morning had a segment on the drones, and they had this, did you see it? They had a scientist flying a little hummingbird with his big beak that could have been a stinger. It was very interesting. I just thought of that when you mentioned it. And one other comment, you mentioned the sapphire stone. It reminded me of some things that I read about how some of the early knowledge could have been passed on from like Adam to Enoch and then to Noah through this sapphire stone. I think it was, who was it? Von Daniken may have had some of that in one of his books, but just was
really?
Interesting parallel there. So I'm excited because I hear you touch upon many of the things that we cover on this show time and time again. I'm just going to ask you a general question. How are you received in the Christian community? I don't know if you do speaking tours and that sort of thing.
I don't bother with the mainstream Christian community because they're not going to be interested in this. they want to do self-help books and feel good stuff, and that's not what God wants. He wants us to understand what's about to hit the earth. And these people are going to get blindsided, and they're going to be people talked about in the fifth seal. If not properly ready and prepared for what's about to hit, they're going to be out of luck. It's a tragic thing. The idea of, I don't know if you guys have, what your position is. My opinion of the pre-tribulational rapture is may have been purposely seeded in order to pin down Christianity long enough for them to be sucker punched into being enslaved and destroyed by the forces of the Antichrist. I think it's the worst thing ever to hit the Christian theology since, I don't know, Mormonism. But it's just, Christians are sitting ducks, and you're talking about mainstream Christianity. If things are going to hit like I think they are, mainstream Christianity, within 3 to 5 years it's going to cease to exist, so it's going to be a moot point. My purpose is to get the information out as soon as possible, get it seeded so those who have wisdom and understanding will spread it, and at least, if not believe it, will understand it, so when the time comes, they'll be prepared.
So the Revelation and the return of the dragon, what verses are you referring to in Revelation? And tell us a little bit about how you perceive that kind of unfolding, the Revelation and the book of Revelation and the return of the dragon. How do you see? What are people going to see? What are they going to experience? Paint us a picture.
Basically, the dragon, the power of the dragon, in the creation, the dragon was kind of symbolized the earth, and the dragon power was the earth power. It was kind of the nefesh, the soul power, which is the light that comes forth from the earth. This great power will rise again in the end times, and it will marshal its forces in preparation to fight off the second coming of Christ. And a scenario very similar to that had happened in the beginning. Now, if you look at stuff like Psalm 74 and Isaiah 27, and a number of verses, Job 9, a number of places in Job, actually, quite a few places, if you translate it correctly. The dragon is a consistent enemy of God since the beginning. Even though the dragon makes occasional appearances throughout the text, for example, Herod are kind of thought of as a dragon because it's, Revelation 12 describes how the forces of the dragon persecute the children of the woman and try to devour the man-child she brought forth and so forth who was caught up to heaven. That is a description, of course, of Jesus, but the dragon remains on earth seeking to devour the believers. And the power of the dragon becomes most prominent in the end times, described in the book of Revelation, where the dragon, also known as the beast, will revive its power and build another empire. This empire, the purpose of this empire, and the massive expenditure of probably their remaining strength in order to create a defense against the second coming. That's the primary purpose of all this technology we're seeing, is the use of the technology is to create super weapons, ultimately, that they will try to use to fight against the second coming. It will fail, but they will try their hardest. So we'll see at the very end massive super weapons, scalar weapons, huge guns, missiles aimed not at other countries, but at heavens, and preparation psychologically for a possible alien invasion. This will be what we will begin to see right before the time of the end, when Jesus actually returns. And we're beginning to see it now with a massive, almost frantic attempts to confiscate all guns because they know planet X is on its way. God is about to judge the earth. And in order to fight off the forces of heaven with any kind of effectiveness, the earth has to be united against him. And the only way to unite the earth is to take away all ability to fight back against centralized government. So this is why we're seeing attempt to grab guns, because they know as long as people have the ability to defend themselves, a one-world government is not possible.
Space weapons. There's this big thrust out there. They've got specialized satellites out there, supposedly, according to some whistleblowers that are out there watching for, for lack of a better term, incoming. They've got space weapons and stuff out there that there's lots of controversy over that. What do you perceive that is the evil cabal on the earth ultimately preparing for the big show? Is that how you're seeing this go down, or what do you think?
Do you remember did you ever watch The Simpsons?
Yeah.
That show?
Sure.
Remember the episode with Kang and Kodos? Now they took over Clinton and the other guy, the Republican candidate, and he says you have to vote for one of us. It's a two-party system. And they remember either one was voted in. The ultimate end game was mankind was going to be basically put to work to building super weapons to fight against their enemies on other planets. And the catch line at the end, of course, Homer saying, "Don't blame me, I voted for Kodos," means that no matter who you vote for, the end game is in place. The date is set. We are being used to build the empire of the beast, and once we are no longer useful, we are going to be gotten rid of. That's what happens in the book of Revelation. Satan uses God's people to provide the stability and moral fiber of the empire, and once they're no longer useful, he gets rid of them and then uses the remaining people, forcing them to work for him through technological means, like I mentioned with Morgellons. So there's no way they can't comply. And that will be the empire of the beast in its final form, which Satan will use to fight against the second coming, and possibly even attempt to take heaven, attack heaven itself.
Wow. So, and are you seeing HARP as part of that, portfolio of weaponry?
Anything technological in nature, yes. HARP, all that other stuff. I believe, even though HARP itself might not have been directly given by the fallen angels, the ideas and the basic concepts were given to us by fallen angels or by crashed, so-called alien craft, which we then were able to figure out how they were built, and that massively accelerated our understanding of technology, particularly in the 20th century, because they realized that these fallen beings who have been coming down for a while now, the Roswell crash being only the most prominent of many different crashes, these beings were probably defeated in heavenly warfare and fled to the earth, which is kind of their last redoubt, the last stronghold, in maybe the entire universe. And so they decided their only choice was to use the remaining humans on Earth to kind of try to ally with them. In order to do that, they gave them technology in trade for their secrets, their technological secrets. In return, we gave them, access to our populations and so forth, which is exactly how modern UFO researchers describe what happened under Truman. Truman said, okay, you can have access to our people, just give us your technology. And that's why we had the massive increase in technology after 1947.
So wait, I'm sorry to interrupt. So you mentioned Truman. Are you referring to the Greada Treaty?
I'm not sure what that is.
Oh, okay. Well, there are those out there who believe that around about that time there was a treaty that was signed with, what we would refer to as fallen angels in some type of flesh body, aliens is what they called it, and the treaty was to ultimately allow them to continue to abduct human beings.
Yes, in terms of the technology, we were given, we gave them the access to the people so they could use them to, for lack of a better term, create newer, better bodies for themselves. And that because their bodies, apparently, the genetics were beginning to break down, and they needed fresh blood, if you will. So that was the trade-off, and it's part of the reason we're so technologically advanced is because we're living in an environment of technology based on stolen information from heaven, because these beings were not supposed to give us that information. These are the beings who left their first estate and came down from heaven to earth and taught mankind medicine and herbs and architecture and astronomy, just as described in the book of Enoch and also to some extent in Genesis 4.
Right.
Genesis 4 doesn't explicitly state it, but Cain and his descendants were technologically sophisticated. The two primary areas they described in Genesis 4 were metallurgy and music. These are the two of the primary areas mentioned by Enoch in the book of Enoch also. The idea being that possibly I think what Moses intended to get the idea across was that the descendants of Cain had mastered the use of sound and vibration in order to manipulate matter and to create very high quality, high technology instrumentation, weapons, armor, technology, maybe even supercomputers along the lines I implied with the Sapphire. Sapphire, by the way, are crystal-based hard drives actually do exist right now, so the technology is real. That I think is one of the top technologies they developed in the world before the flood. And it was so powerful that it ended up in their destruction. In fact, I suspect wars were fought over the control of this particular jewel, which was hidden underneath the Sphinx. in order to keep anyone else from misusing it. And after that went into the possession of the patriarchs, because only they could be trusted with its use, because putting it into the hands of the giants or one of their descendants ultimately led to tyranny. So it became necessary. Now I'm talking about this in my book on the giants, which I'm writing right now, actually, which will come out this summer from Defender Press. How this is a kind of the MacGuffin of the entire story, the conflict between the giants and the sons of Seth. It was control of this sapphire stone, this supercomputer, the knowledge of which contained on it was so dangerous that it couldn't just, God made sure that only the patriarchs had access to it, and even then only very limited access. This included Moses as well, and also possibly King David. I talk about that. I'll talk about that in my book as well. But yeah, basically the fallen angels gave technology to mankind in the world before the flood, and now they're giving it to us again, and with similar effects, right before the judgment falls. So we have a repeating pattern, just as it was in the beginning, so it will be in the end.
Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. Praise Jesus. And so that's
exactly.
Yeah. So basically, when Genesis 11 verse 6b basically says, now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them, your postulation would be that this potentially has something or some connection to do with this Sapphire supercomputer thing, right?
Correct. The Sapphire supercomputer may have been literally stolen from heaven. It says in Ezekiel 28 of Satan, he literally walked up and down amongst the stones of fire in the Garden of Eden. This is what I think is referring to as this firestone, is this sapphire, which uses a laser to read and write to and from the disk, the fire being the laser. So this firestone might be actually referring to these sapphire hard drives, for lack of a better term, which contain knowledge and information on them about everything. Schematics, blueprints, how-to type information, how to build weapons, how to build armor, how to do simpler things like grow crops, do animal husbandry, modify the human genome or the genome of other plants and animals. And when they cracked into this code and got into this thing, they learned how to manipulate everything. That's when the Pandora's box was opened, which may also be, by the way, it's yet another metaphor for the same object. I'm finding that this thing is like the blind man and the elephant. It passes through history and hits some of the most important points of history. I believe it's present there. But it's described in different ways by different people at different times, but it's the same thing over and over again. I've considered the possibility it might even be the tree of knowledge and things of that nature, which would make sense, because if they are able to get into the stone and find all the secrets, their eyes would be opened and nothing would be withheld from them.
Wow, that's awesome. So if you would, Douglas, please share with everybody your website URLs and mention, if you will, the title of the new book that you're working on, because this is some really exciting stuff, and I feel confident people are going to want to know about this.
If true, it's revolutionary. The first book is Planet X, The Sign of the Son of Man and the End of the Age, available through Defender Press. You can go to survivormall.com or through Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, or through your local bookstore. You can order through your Christian bookstore. Please do that, because that way they'll be more likely to stock copies on their shelves if you order it through a Christian bookstore, or a regular bookstore for that matter. The other book I mentioned is a Kindle ebook called The Riddle of the Sphinx. That is available exclusively on Amazon Kindle. You can go to Amazon.com's Kindle section and type in The Riddle of the Sphinx, or you can go to www.mysteriousworld.com/riddle. If you want to, there's some nice free articles about the giants and other things available at www.mysteriousworld.com. If you want to talk to me about anything, any questions, you can either reach me on my Facebook page at just type in Planet X or Mysterious World. That should be the top result in Facebook. You can also friend me on Facebook at name is Doug Elwell, DOUGELWELL, and you can also send me a direct email at publisher@mysteriousworld.com.
Wow, praise Jesus! Thank you, Doug, for joining us.